Mary Magdalene wearing red. Red is associated in medieval art with many things. One is martyrdom, martyr. And another one is passion, usually related to sexual immorality. But I was just very intrigued how, for example, this artist, Roger Weyden, he is a Flemish artist. Any work you see from him is beautiful. It makes me cry. It's just very emotive. But he decided to dress her in green, which in the medieval times, for example, green was a color that represented life. Then you have also some paintings. For example, this is called the Magdalene. And there were these people who would ask artists, hey, can you do my portrait as if I was Mary Magdalene? Which is what this woman did. It's a woman that they associate with the name Mary Tudor. And it's believed to be from Spain, but so she is this woman, but just wanted to include a Mary Magdalene element, which was the jar. Another important thing, though, that it's interesting is that in the medieval times, whenever you see women that had a book or they are reading something, books in the medieval art reflects wealth, reflects that that woman had some level of education or instruction, and that she cared about her own education as well, that she was interested in reading, in doing this academic thing. So you have a lot of art from Mary Magdalene where she will be reading, which is very, also to me, it makes me wonder if perhaps some artists did consider the fact that we do see how in Luke 8, the gospel says that these women were providing for Jesus. Therefore, these were Mary Magdalene and others were women of means. So it's just something that I wonder if that was also part of the thought whenever including, because for sure, whether it was on religious art or not, but a book, and especially with women, would indicate wealth. So that is something interesting that we see in some of those Mary Magdalene scenes. Another one that we also see, so I want to talk from these paintings that we have here. I want to talk about the hair. As we learned earlier with Dr. Kohik, hair says very much about the status of a woman in ways that, thinking about History Month right now and all the things that we are celebrating, that we have access, is so wild that now in this time, there are still so many stigmas about hair and in many ways, and yet at the same time, there is much more freedom than back then to wear your hair however you would like in certain settings with the fear of being judged. Not in all settings for sure, but definitely back then, if a woman dared to wear her hair loose, it was seen as a promiscuous woman, as a woman who is sexually immoral. So she is portrayed like that. Just in some instances, like some of the paintings we see with the hair, it may be arranged specifically as a prostitute, but if it was just a loose hair, it just will say equal sexually immoral woman. So it's very common to see her. It's unfortunate because sometimes you will have great scenes like this one, the Lamentation over Dead Christ, which will be part of these altar pieces that will be in the back of a church like this, that will retold a story. And it's a great scene, and yet, but you also have the hair element, which very interestingly with Mary, the mother of Jesus, she is not portrayed ever wearing that hair. So anyway, I mean, this is definitely a much better image of Mary Magdalene than this one. But yet, you will have those elements there that are going to mistell her story. So, and then we also see very common nakedness. For the most part, it will be from waist up. We see her in scenes like this where it seems like she went away into the wilderness to to repent, to meditate. And many times, though, the artist will say, well, I am not putting her in those clothes because I want to show everybody how sinful she was, but I just want to show that because she has been away that long, now her clothes are starting to get ragged. And now her clothes that originally covered now are not that that new anymore. That's why you see her like that. So some artists would include that element, but still, I mean, if we see these images immediately, our minds are not going to go, oh, this was a woman who was devoted necessarily. Like we see that element of sexuality there. She is portrayed whenever she is in these settings with a skull. A skull in this type of paintings will reflect about the mortality of life, how life is not something that lasts. And then in other times as well, she again appears with the book. Actually, in most of them, like for example in this one from Karachi, it's under the skull. So yeah, this just repentant Mary. So those are just some traditional ways that they have portrayed that will tell us specific stories about either a legend, or some of them may be about a biblical story, but others might be about an oral tradition of who this Mary Magdalene is. So I'm not saying that these images, of course, now when we have all this background from where she's coming from, we know, well, yeah, that was not Mary. But at least if I go into a book, into a museum, and I see an image like that, it's very likely I'm going to find underneath a title that says the Magdalene or Mary Magdalene. So those are like elements that are going to help us to identify who she was in art. So for now, the next one that I want to talk about different themes and subjects also related to Mary Magdalene. So we have a phrase, nel suo peccato porta penitenza, and that is a very ancient Italian phrase that later was translated into Spanish. And it means, in her sin, she carries the penitence. It's basically, it means that you are, if somebody says that to you, it means that you are paying the consequences of your acts or of your sins. But not in a way that, okay, you're paying the consequences and then you move on, but more as you are constantly repenting. And I would tell you, for example, in the Catholic Church, I grew up in the Catholic Church up until I was in middle school. And there were these moments in liturgy that I go to an Anglican church now where we every Sunday have moments of repentance, but very different from when I was in the Catholic Church, in the way that, for instance, in the Anglican Church, we see it as I am repenting and I am accepting God's grace and I am continuing that. And then next week I'm going to do the same because it's a constant reminder, but not something that is holding me captive. Where in the Catholic tradition, it was a lot of weight in the, I did this, I'm a sinner, for my fault, for my fault, for my fault. Like you have to say even phrases like that constantly. So in this theme, what we see is just this Mary Magdalene that is almost like a non-ending cycle of her in the wilderness, penitent and repenting and carrying this stigma of being a promiscuous woman, and yet not seeing a lot of redemption, actually, of her moving forward. So it's a very sad thing, in my opinion, especially when we study the Mary Magdalene from Scripture, who, again, was a woman of means, who was there at the cross, at the tomb, as a disciple of Christ, even as an apostle of apostles, which was a title Thomas Aquinas gave her. And then later in the 80s, John Paul II called her that again. So it's unfortunate we have those images, but however, too, they tell us a story. So, for example, speaking about the Golden Legend, we have this is like a French work from the 1500s, and it's a story specifically in the French tradition of Mary being in the desert for about 30 days, and then angels coming every day to feed her and to nourish her. And it's very interesting. I think about how in those times, even though people didn't have Bibles for themselves to carry as we do today, but definitely by that time, people have heard and are familiar with the stories such as Elijah in the Old Testament, that he was being fed by animals. Or, of course, the story of Jesus being in the wilderness, and episodes in the Gospels where we see that angels will come down and serve him. So these extra biblical stories that later transform into works of art are feeding from those biblical stories in a way and creating their own. This is called the Ecstasy of Saint Mary Magdalene. And this word ecstasy, even though it can be linked in a way with a sexual orientation, it's also a very common word in the medieval times, because we have a group of people we call mystics, like Catherine of Siena, like Francis of Assisi, that will have these supernatural encounters with the divine. So whenever we see the word ecstasy in any art from the medieval or early Renaissance, it's referring to just a supernatural episode that the person encountered with Jesus. I'm going to talk first this and then we'll say something there. But Titian, he did many versions of the penitent Mary Magdalene. And he sort of, for the Renaissance times, opened that road for a Mary that looked exactly like this, covering the breast with a hand on, like here on her shoulder, looking at heaven. So there are a lot of images that we see in the Renaissance that he started. It's very interesting. This is a work, for example, from one of his early career. And then as he kept on going, he decided to put her naked. So it was almost like these stages of Mary, a penitent Mary that it is starting her journey. And then as it keeps on going, she looks worse and worse, basically. So as a work of art, I really like this sculpture from Donatello. Outside, of course, I don't appreciate the theme, of course, because we now know the story of the true Mary Magdalene. But something very unique about this sculpture is, so this happened in the late 15th century, where by then sculptures already are working with marble. And most of the sculptures, as we saw, that they are taking this influence from classical art, are voluptuous women and beautiful women. But yet, he chose not to work with any of those materials, not to do any of the similar works that he had done in the past, and yet he decided to work with wood, which wood is not... people will use that material to do sculptures, but definitely not for things that you wanted to put in a church or to have people appreciate how beautiful they were. So Donatello uses wood to portray a little bit more of an organic, natural element to transmit Mary Magdalene's humanity to the viewer. Another thing that he does, for example, this may look like a very thin Mary, and it's not that Donatello didn't know proportions well, but it's just on purpose, like wanting to make her a very frail creature so that people could see how seriously she was in this penitent road, and how serious she was, that no more she is focusing on the beauty aspect of it or her body, but actually her spirituality. So I appreciate just that sentiment of him doing those taking the time to choose the materials that will portray this message or convey this message. But at the same time, again, we just have learned these are definitely not something that I want to use perhaps as my ideal of Mary Magdalene, because it is definitely not giving her or doing her justice. But from a work of art is definitely something to appreciate. We're gonna just keep on moving to other themes. So, we have the Via Crucis, which is the way of the cross. And in that specific way of the cross where we see Mary, is going to be in the crucifixion. It's going to be previous to the burial, and of course later in the empty tomb and resurrection. So there are a lot of interesting things happening here. It was very common in the medieval art, for example, around the 1300s, the 1200s, if a pope or if a rich person commissioned an artist to do a fresco or to paint a chapel, they were like, but you have to put me in there. And especially you need to put me right there next to Jesus. So it's the case here. We have, some people will say this is Francis of Assisi. It's also attribute just a regular priest there. And then you have Mary Magdalene right here with black as it represents death, and then Christ and the angels. You have also a fresco by Giotto, who even though he was an artist from the medieval times, he definitely paved the way to Renaissance in the way he portrayed facial gestures in ways nobody really had done before. So I really love this fresco, this painting from the Life of Christ cycles that he has in his chapel, because you see Mary, his mother, in the part, like in that Pietà moment where Mary's holding Jesus, and then you see Mary Magdalene at his feet. So just portraying these women that are there with Jesus all along the way, and just devoted to him and really mourning the passing and what is going on. And then you have other, like the Flemish artists right here, where you see Mary Magdalene not really dressed in any of the colors that we constantly see her, like the red. She's wearing like the prostitute hair though, over here. But there she is at the feet of the cross, and Mary, John. So you have just subjects like the Via Crucis where she is going to be in those, present in those moments. You have also what I was explaining earlier, how in the medieval times, the background is mostly flat, just like shining through. But then in the Renaissance, you have scenes of life or landscapes happening behind. And I want to just share this ones really quick. If people were not confused enough about which Mary is who, then you had artists like Battista Galli who were like, let's just confuse people even further. And you have these three Marys figures going to the cross, but yet we can see who was the Magdalene because of the hair, because of the jar. And it's funny, later in the 19th century, William Blake took this as a reference to do this work. And he was like, now I'm going to confuse people even farther because the three women are carrying a vessel. But yet, you have the flowing hair here, so it's most likely that this is a figure referring to the figure of Mary, the traditional figure of Mary Magdalene. So the color blue is mostly used for people like Jesus, of course, and Mary. It is the hue in ancient art, in medieval art, that will represent purity at its most. Why sometimes we see Jesus, like I was looking over there, they did the red and the blue, because he represents all that is pure and good, but he also brings the martyr element. So that's why sometimes they will put him in red and blue. So anyway, just that to say that, there she is wearing blue, Mary, Mother, Jesus, and then the red that constantly uh, identifies her. So something that has been happening through time with art, and especially by the time that we are in the 19th century, those colors now, you have the option to include them, but you don't have to include them in the same way as today with art and postmodern art. You can make anything you want and give it whatever approach you want, and it's going to say is art, right? But back then, art definitely had a little bit more specific boundaries. So it's also very interesting just to see how things like that have been evolving. We have, of course, the Noli Me Tangere or Non Mi Tocchi, Don't Touch Me. And it's interesting, for example, this artist over here, Santa Croce, he dresses Jesus sort of like a farmer because she thought that he was a farmer. So you will have some renditions of very literal figures like this. And then, of course, we have like the medieval, the Byzantine, like with the specific halos around there, the Stoic faces. So yeah, these are just different ways that they will portray this Don't Touch Me theme. And I wanted to just take some time here. This is my last slide, but I want just to reflect on this. These two are my personal favorite art pieces related to Mary Magdalene, because something I wanted also to just tell you or address. It's so interesting how in this like penitent Mary Magdalene stories or artworks, she's always like isolated and by herself. But like when we see the biblical accounts, she's not by herself. She is with other women. She is there with, apart from the time where she saw Jesus resurrected, which is a very different connotation than being by yourself, seeing Jesus for the first time, as opposed as being by yourself, crying and never-ending cycle of penitence, right? But we just, in the scripture, don't really see Mary as isolated away from the rest, but we see her there with Jesus, with the women, doing the work that she was called to do. And that's why I really love this last couple images. This is by an artist called El Greco, which he is from Greece, but lived most of his life in Spain. And another Spanish artist called Juan Bautista Milano. So this is of course, the crucifixion. I love that he did not portray Mary Magdalene with the red that is usually accompanying her, but actually with the blue color right there. I also love in that Pentecost image, just a lot of Pentecost images, by the way, if they have women, it's mostly going to be Mary, the mother of Jesus. But some of them, like this one, you're going to have Mary Magdalene as well included, which just gives you a sense of she was there with the 12 and others ready to receive that Holy Spirit. And I just think I come from a background very conservative where women, we were only able to do very few things. And the moment that you were stepping out of that tiny square, you were seen as something is wrong with you. And so to me, honestly, when I see this and when I actually take time to meditate on what the biblical text says about women like Mary Magdalene, it's just very encouraging, as of course it is for all of us. But Mary Magdalene ultimately was a life transformed by the power of Jesus. We know the story how when Jesus, or when she had those 7 demons expelled, which, by the way, we can talk about all this and never end, but like that part of like the demon expulsion, some people have taken as equal sexual immorality, where, it would be really hard to go that route, because how many people in the Gospels we saw, men and women who had demons, and did that mean that they were sexually immoral? So it's that element. She was a true Christ disciple. She was last in death and first in the resurrection, and the apostle of apostles, which is just very refreshing that at least the church tried to redeem, people like Aquinas, who wasn't necessarily that champion for women in many ways, but he called her that, and then later John Paul II did that as well. So I think that all of the art that we see about Mary Magdalene out there, especially from these times, something is great that her story, her figure has been immortalized in so many ways, and that centuries later here we are talking about it. But it's also great that artists had the time to just go back and actually study the biblical text and actually portray her in ways that she should be portrayed, because I think that is something that art and art history should help us, especially in our times today. It's okay to look back to those images and to appreciate sometimes the art aspect of it, but at the same time, it's important to just see what is going on, what has gone wrong, and how can we rectify, and how can we portray it right. So, yeah, that's just very encouraging to me in my life, in my as a teacher, as an artist, and I'm sure that for all of us that we've been in theological circles as women, just having stories like hers give us the hope that, yes, God has called us regardless of anything. And I just love how Jesus was a great, very radical person in having men and women with him and just loving no matter how people around him perceive it. So, yeah, I just want to leave you with that. And if there are any questions, would love to. Yes. Those? Okay. Right. This one? This one? Okay. Yeah, I think that your point is absolutely right. We are definitely seeing her as more introspective as opposed as woo is me, kind of, which some artists would do that. There are a lot of liberties that they could take with the image of penitent Magdalene. So some of them will take references of what would have been done in the past and kind of do it the same in their style. But other artists will definitely change the focus. And as you said, it's very true. When we see different, it basically could be the same theme, but at the same time, it's very different, the gaze and what she is doing or the way she is portraying herself. So, yes. Okay. Yeah, thank you. That is a very important point, for sure, because if we think about the Reformation and just how by the 1500s there are already a lot of challenges against the church in ways that it's not that it wasn't there before, but definitely, and then specifically with the Renaissance and thus rebirth and rethinking many things. Now people are questioning and challenging ways that they haven't done in the past. So that is definitely a very important aspect. Thank you for sure. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I would say, and I am not by any means claiming being an expert, this is my opinion. I think that sometimes also from the Western world, and specifically in the US, the way we read a text or we see an image and what it comes to our minds may not or may like necessarily be the way they would have interpret in the past. So for example, specifically like this one, which comes still from medieval times, like what I was explaining in the sense that the body language was important, but many artists wouldn't actually have that many embracing moments. Before at least Giotto, he was one of the first, or the first, who even included a kiss, for example, in the early 1300s, which was unheard of, because that was not something that was part of the way they were portraying these stories. So sometimes when we see images like this could be related to how they would interpret and portray a specific story, where now in our days and specifically in our cultures, yes, we will expect to see an image where is this woman clinging, touching with a lot of strength, maybe. So I think that it could be, I'm not saying that is, but in my opinion, it could be around those lines. So, yes. Some of these artists, titles, it actually would be named like that. So either they will take it from maybe a mass liturgy that was going on at the time, or just because artists before them would have done that. For the penitents, like that one, for example, that was just a common saying back then that fed into this, that these images fed into it, for instance. So like they will have the freedom to give the title unless, because sometimes a lot of this art was commissioned. It was not for like, come see my gallery, but it was like the Pope or the priest wants them to do a piece and they will say, hey, we need a piece on Noli Me Tangere, or we need a piece on a penitent Magdalene to put. So they will be asked for that. And then some of them, as I said, would just name them a little differently or just will use the title based on the commission that they had received. Ay, perdón. Yeah, so what I mentioned was how in the medieval times the book element in women was referring to wealth, referring to a woman who knew. Sometimes, specifically 14, 1500s, and even if people will be like, hey, I want this artwork to have in my home, for instance, it would be asked to have these elements just because sometimes in those periods, they also did art that it's the biblical character, but it looks like a person from those days. Does that make sense? Like, for example, these ones. Of course, Mary Magdalene did not wear those clothes, but that is how people dress back in the day. So it is very common from the Quattrocento, like the 14s, the 15s, that they will have images of biblical figures that portrayed in a way how people look at that time. And then if I have a book in there that elevates the status basically of the figure that I am representing. And then on top of it, if it's me actually there, it's kind of like having my portrait made by a great master, if that makes sense. So, and sorry, Christian, you had a... Yeah. No, I think definitely because it just gives us a lot of ways to interpret. And like if you have Mary, the mother of Jesus, I'm not saying there is no room for extra biblical sources. There is. But it is very clear who she was from day one. Where with Mary Magdalene, it's really not. So you have all these different legends and the stories that can give you endless of opportunities to portray or it gives artists opportunities to take any of those and portray them how they would like to. So that I think that's probably why, just because a lot of it either can get confused by somebody else or just have a lot of stories going on around that topic. But thank you very much, and appreciate it.
Jazmine, do y'all want to see my email? Oh, I got some spam. Great. That'd be great if I had my reading glasses. Yeah, I can't read that print right now. Hold on. All right, very good. Now that I'm on the spot, yeah, I mean, I'm not the only one who didn't bring up their reading glasses and therefore can't find the right thing to click. But let me continue on. Jazmine, thank you so very much. I am continually both impressed and appreciative of not only your knowledge base, but the demeanor with which you teach. Thank you for having both on display to bless us like that. It is also my pleasure to give you a wonderful announcement. About a year and a half ago, Dr. Glahn and Dr. Kohik took a group of Masters in Arts and Theology students from Northern Seminary on a tour of Italy. And the images that they got and the experiences that they had which a lot of the experiences had to do with gelato. If you talk to them about the trip, there's a lot of gelato. There was a lot of gelato, right? I mean, like they were all, and so many of them are here. Christian, you were on the trip. Kelly Matthews, you were on the trip. Christine, you were on the trip. Charlotte Graham was on the trip. Many of them many of the people here in this room were actually on that trip. And Shala went as the photographer who has populated the database of the Visual Museum with lots of our images thus far. The announcement I have to give you is that we are going back to Italy. I know, right? And so today is the public announcement. You're the very first audience to get this information that we're going back to Italy. So right now, you usually are not told this in church, but please get out your phones. I want you to go to the Visual Museum at visualmuseum.gallery. Give me a nod when you're there. All right, on that homepage, there should be an announcement, a banner on the homepage about Italy. That takes you to the webpage where not only do you have the full itinerary, but also links to all the accommodations and a place to register at the bottom. We're asking for a deposit of $300 per traveler. This is a deposit that is refundable up until May 31st, simply because we are in the process. We've made the arrangements for the accommodations, but we're still in the process of doing the budgeting related to some ticketing of sites. So therefore, we have an estimated cost, which is on the website. When we have that as a firm, we are definite on that number, then there will be a time frame for you to consider it with the final cost. We only have a couple limited spots on the trip. We're going to take a maximum of 30 travelers with us. So you are the first audience to hear about this, and I hope that you join us to Italy. Okay? So now we have lunch. Who wants lunch? The lunch is going to be in the Great Hall. So we go out of these doors and we take a left. I'll see you there.
And to the left, you keep going through the museum to the white building beyond that.